Hello everyone, my name is Mohammed,
My name is Adam Yassine.
Hi, I'm Sabina Kuyala.
and today we're going to present our MyPass web application. So the design patterns that we decided to use for implementing this web application are decorator pattern, proxy pattern, and command pattern. Let's start with the decorator pattern. So the decorator pattern, we use this pattern design for generating a strong password for users. So what it does is basically gets the password from user and validates it. And based on that validation, it would add like different stuff to it. For example, it can add special character, uppercase characters, lowercase, and it checks the length of the password, and also it adds a number to the password.
Yes, so if the password has less than 8 characters, it makes sure it is 8 characters. Um, and yeah, so essentially, the sign-in page processes the password and runs it through a validation function in user to find out which decorators need to be called dynamically, and it runs the password through those decorators to suggest a password that will always meet the criteria we need to be considered secure by this website. And so let's move on to the proxy pattern.
So for the proxy pattern, this pattern we use for the logging in process. So once the user tries to log into our application, they input a username and password, and the protection proxy try to validate it. And if they enter the right username and password, they under this it will direct the user to the real client, and they can go to the vault. And so basically these features, what's doing is authorizing the login and valid username and password to the real client. And once the username and password is authorized, it will direct the users to the vault. That's all it's doing on the proxy pattern.
Yep. And so moving on to the command pattern, we essentially have a class system that implements 3 concrete commands that depend on the receiver. And so we have validate login command, get data command, and create login command. And so essentially validate login command executes the validate login function in receiver, which sends a post request to our backend web server to validate the account, and based off of the status code delivered by that API, signals if the user and password combination are valid to access a page. The create login command is essentially a post request to our API that adds a username and password to our database, and our get data command pulls all of the data in the database belonging to the particular account once it has been validated. And so the actual web server code is implemented in a separate file, which I will be going over really quickly. But the command pattern actually generates the requests to that API. And so when talking about the overall application, you can kind of see how these design patterns work together. Because the decorator pattern is used in the sign-up page, whereas the proxy pattern is used in the sign-in page, they aren't really interlinked together, but they both make use of our command pattern. And so our decorator pattern generates a strong password, which, if entered in the sign-up page, will insert the username and password into the database, whereas our protection proxy uses the command pattern to validate the account, and based off of the status code returned by that API call, will redirect to the vault. And so the command pattern is important for the web application to be able to properly keep data updated and redirect to other pages. And so I'm going to go over the code used in these design patterns right here. So going over the classes used to fully implement the decorator pattern, I just want to talk about a function that is called by the HTML page once the submit button is hit. And so what it does is it pulls the entered username and password into a user object up here. And once that is done, runs it through this validation function or validate password function, which sets flags to true if different conditions are met. And so that'll be an array. So the 0 value corresponds to capital letters. The second value corresponds to lowercase letter. Third value corresponds to a number. The fourth value corresponds to a special character, and the fifth number corresponds to the length of the password being eight or more characters. And so it'll return a true or false flag indicating if all the criteria has been met. And so if the criteria has been met, it will call the command pattern to insert the username and password into the database as an account and display on the page that the sign up has been completed, telling the user to log in using the sign in page. But if the password isn't validated, because we have the individual flags for what hasn't been validated, it will create a password object and loop through that array, and based on what is false, pass the password object through the decorator, generating the strong password. And so let's talk about the sign-in page. If we are talking about the sign-in page, this is the proxy pattern used. And so essentially the real client is simple. It just has a redirect function that takes us to the vault page, which is this page.html. But the protection proxy is what matters. So the sign-in page, once the user attempts to sign in with an entered username and password, a function called login in this protection proxy example class will be triggered that gets those values, passes them into a protection proxy object, calling its redirect function. So you can see the constructor here. But the redirect function essentially calls the invoker object to create or to validate the login. And if the status code returned is 200, which is in this line of code here, then it'll redirect. However, I've commented out that line of code and replaced that with a dummy statement for the purpose of this presentation, since to actually run the post request, in this scenario, I would need a host on a web server, which cannot be done right now. And so that is that. And now to go over the actual command pattern, essentially we have our receiver, which has the post request for all of these, returning the objects. And so insert account and validate login have already been talked about, but get data essentially calls the API to validate the account. And if the account has been validated, it will return the JSON with all of the account's values that have been pulled from the database. And so here's our invoker. It essentially, there is some control flow based off of a request string that decides which command to be executed. And we have the concrete commands, which essentially call its corresponding receivers or its corresponding method within the receiver. And so that is all of the source code belonging to our design patterns. And so let me actually demonstrate the application itself. So this is our homepage. And so let's hypothetically create an account, okay? If I want to use my Umish email and enter an invalid password, such as you will see the warnings, right? So we need an uppercase letter, we need a number, we need a special character, and we need 8 or more characters. And here's a suggested strong password that meets this criteria. Now notice that it didn't say password must have 1 or more lowercase characters. That warning was not displayed because the password entered contained a lowercase value. And so if I enter an uppercase value, you will see that this gets replaced with a lowercase value. And so let me just enter the valid password, sign up. It will essentially direct us to log in. So once we sign in, I can enter my Umish account and I can do the password I've entered. Normally this password would be masked, but for the purpose of this presentation, I had it not be masked just so you can see my inputs. But once we sign in, we access the data and you can see we have login, credit card, identity, and secure notes. And so they're initially masked, but we can unmask all of these values. Furthermore, we can also copy these values. So see, that was my user. And after 5 seconds, it will time out the page, taking us back to the home page, and it will also clear the clipboard. So if I try to paste now, when it was originally my username, it's just the character D. I picked the character D because I couldn't find a way to clear the clipboard entirely, but I could replace it with a dummy value. And so I did that just because it would get rid of the sensitive data in the clipboard. But yeah, normally I would set this timeout period to be much longer, but for the purpose of this presentation, I had it just be 5 seconds. And it's important to note that because it was it's important to note that once the page times out and takes us back to the home page, the clipboard is cleared at the same time. So both the timeout set to reload to take us back to the home page and the timeout to clear the clipboard are the exact same. So that is our application. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you.